very high. As compared to similar studies, is it at a similar level, or is it higher or lower?
No, it's not 52, it's 32.
Okay.
So 32, yeah, not 50.
Okay, sorry, 32. Okay,
32.
my bad. Sorry, I didn't hear you.
No, 52, I would have been very surprised if I got 52.
That's what I was thinking.
That doesn't sound
really
right. No, no, no.
Yes.
31 and the 32 is fine.
Okay, okay. Sorry about that. Thank you very much for the clarification. Okay, well, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I believe now we can move to our second presentation. Our presenter is Anuratha Venkataraman from IIM Kashipur, and his presentation is Performance Appraisal and Me, Retrospect and Prospect, Performance Appraisal and the Indian ITES Software Employee as an Ethnographic Study. Raman, you can start your presentation whenever you are ready. Raman, I believe you are on mute right now. Could you unmute yourself? Raman, we still cannot hear you. Could you unmute yourself, please? Can you hear Raman, or is it just me? Can you hear the presenter? Anyone? You can't hear, right?
I can see his microphone is on there.
Yeah.
Maybe wave at him.
Yichan, could you unmute Raman's microphone, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, am I audible now?
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
Okay,
That's great.
right.
Thank you very much.
Now I'll start the presentation now.
Yes, please.
I am going to speak about performance appraisal and the way in which the Indian IT industry constitutes the identity of a person, as it were, in terms of sense making, and how the larger conversation of performance appraisal is imbricated in a larger sense of social relationships that the employees find themselves in the broader phenomenological tradition, and also drawing from a larger conversation in organizational studies, bringing back the John of Nicholson Bynum, the individual in Living with Capitalism, the individual back to center stage in the study of organizations and the world of work. There are two ideas which come to be. If you go to a big city like Bangalore, you go to Starbucks and then you have somebody saying, "I'm Cisco," and then she's typing virtually sitting with her team in faraway New York. And the other hand, you have the same person tomorrow who leaves the organization and then finds herself without that identity called being a Cisco employee. So the question is that, what impact does this conversation of performance appraisal have on the Indian IT industry. To give you a sense of the context, the Indian IT industry has grown and is a large facilitator of social mobility. And there is a large paper by Upadhyay and Vasavi who talk about the kind of lifestyle changes that have happened, which was not possible in the earlier times when people used to work on career employment for 20 years and probably still not get the kind of money the IT industry which IT employee made. And second, the IT industry also facilitated a boom in consumption, a boom in brands, in boom in buying of a lot of products, and also linked the larger sense of me and my self validation to the larger consumption that I am able to have, and also tie myself into the having expensive apartments, and also having EMI, and it's a new lifestyle. Right now, the second thing is that you're also trying to say is that the Indian IT industry, to its credit, introduced a large number of work reorganization in its labor process, and also brought in a lot of innovations of soft HRM into it. Right. So that whole broad question that has been beguiling me has been, how do Indian IT employees make sense of themselves in the context of performance appraisal? This was triggered by my larger interest in critical management studies, and a person who I have been really inspired by is Tony Watson's work on In Search of Management, and also Margaret Archer, the great legendary sociologist, who talks about reflexivity and the internal conversation that we always have, and the perpetual emergent nature of ourselves and the organizations we work, drawing upon the work of Norbert Elias, right? So we talk about what does it mean to be an IT employee today? What are the soft HRM practices underpinning the IT industry? And how do Western repertoires of professionalism, individual agency, or autonomy converge and impinge upon the Indian IT labor process? Net, you will all together, how do these managerial repertoires impact the performance appraisal and the whole process of performance management of India, of an Indian IT employee? I'm primarily focusing on the IT industry is vast and varied. You have service providers, you have data analytics, and you have product companies. But in general, I'm just trying to focus mainly on the software service providing, IT-enabled service industry. And I have conducted extensive ethnographic interactions in Bangalore, Delhi, and in Hyderabad, in southern India, to find out, to work with people who work at Cisco, who work with many of the leading Indian and overseas IT providers, IT-enabled service providers, and also trying to find out how do they view themselves in relation to their profession, and how does performance impact them. So in the larger extent of the idea of soft HRM, I would like to draw upon Luke's third dimension of power, and also say that the Indian there has been a lot of conversation on the Foucauldians like Knights and Wilmot and McCabe, and all about how Foucault sometimes misses the point that people are constituted by the subjectivity, right? Now there is also the idea of, you know, the what is actually problematic in the Indian IT industry is that, you know, this has been indicated to be by many of the respondents that they are not able to make sense of what is being told to them. Most of the communication is very sugar coated, and all things seem well, and finally the other person seems on the street, and then away on the road tomorrow, because she or he cannot log into her laptop because the company has shut out her access and she's been laid off, right? So there is a question of, you know, there's a the person, the identity, I am Cisco, or the way in which the company constituted the sapient way of life, and the sapient way of life, you know, intersected into the personal domain, and the way in which she or he thought that she could live her personal life as the sapient or Cisco or whatever company's way of life is no more now, and she's at a loss. And there's a lot of you know, there are a lot of mental health problems, and there are a lot of suicides that happen, right? And the IT professionals are amongst the most stressed lot. And then that we come to the idea of, you know, the India and the developed world, wherein I will also draw upon the de-skilling thesis of you know, labor process theory. You know, that many of the respondents have done extensive interviews. I've had long conversations with many of these developers, BPO, business process analysts, and testers, and many of them have also said that you know, they have no work-life balance, and some of them go to the bathroom with two phones because somebody calls from the other side, and they are not able to say no to that call because they'll be in trouble. And the second thing is, if they try to call somebody in Sweden over the weekend, they're in for trouble from their bosses, right? And it's very, in many of these companies, you know, if you go to probably many of these companies, it's so congenial, the atmosphere, you are not able to make out where, you know, congeniality ends and the subterranean hostility takes over, because you have a teddy bear, then you have somebody like Gerlinde Kaltenbrunner climbing the mountain, and then you're showing all the motivation for the employee that you have to succeed and you have to deliver the timeline, so you have to deliver. So now, given that idea, there is nobody to tell you anything. Unlike you know, a manufacturing company, if you remember Donald Roy's Banana Time, there was a lot of the communication was open, right? There is no open communication. It's all very sugar coated, very sweet, and it's all like the friends, right? And there is a lot of you know, as Carl Weick would say, you know, enactment going on, right? So many of the respondents told me that if somebody's birthday came, I mean, a significant other's birthday, she would actually, the personal and the professional merge in that context, right? Now, given this context that, you know, as Elgar and Smith had already talked, that there are the contradictions of management discourses and practices is also rooted in the material realities of work and employment, and set to affect the efficacy of self-disciplining mechanisms, right? So,
Raman,
yeah.
Raman, excuse me for interrupting, but you are over time now. Could you please wrap up in the next?
Yeah, I'll wrap up. So I'm coming to the idea of you know, that the way in which performance appraisal says that there are only the performance appraisal is key to one's increment and the larger lifestyle choices, because nobody wants to be the next Ramanujan or Wittgenstein, but they would like to, you know, move up and survive the corporate ladder, and you know, just about have incremental skills so as to just about you know, manage their lifestyle and manage their many investments of their identity, which they are social validation, which lie beyond their job. So the bell curve force fits the employee, and there are certain people who get in, and there are certain people who are, whether or out, they are out. And I have a lot of respondents who have actually given their feedback. But now for the first bell curve has led to a more dynamic performance management system, where every call, every conversation, every project task, and every deliverable leads to the panoptic gaze, as it were. And there is slow but sustaining, continuous pressure. And more so that if people are working away alone, there is intense loneliness and psychological strain on many of the IT professionals I interacted with, especially during the post the pandemic. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Raman. It was a very interesting presentation. So the floor is open for questions. I can, oh, Alison, you have a question. That's perfect. Please go ahead.
I was just wondering if you knew, and I'm sorry if I missed this at the beginning, but who is evaluating these workers who are isolated? Like, is it an immediate supervisor, or is it?
It's a team leader, and I'm talking of team leaders and team members. In the IT industry, there are teams, and there are team leaders, and then there are project managers.
Okay, I'm just wondering, like, how far removed is the person who is doing the appraisal from the person that they're appraising? Like, do they have any idea of, you know, the person's home work life, the society, community in which they live, the country in which they live? Like, are they in a different country? Are they?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
I have looked at people in the appraisee and appraiser in India, not outside. And
right.
Yeah.
Sorry, but you talk about, you've mentioned Geneva. So would somebody, like, for example, in Geneva be evaluating somebody in India? Like, I'm just wondering, like, what kind of cross-border, I don't know the phrase that you would use, but what kind of dynamic that would be, and how, if that's influencing it as well, because you kind of alluded to that about how some people progress better than others, and I'm just wondering if you could comment on that dynamic a little bit further, and how the individuals who you've been talking with, do they have a sense of, I guess what I'm talking about is, do they feel shame or humiliation with respect to how they're being treated when they get appraised in a way that's not effective, but also not realistic, and doesn't take in their experience as a person? Do they internalize that and take it very personally, or are they able to just say, oh, that's just some big management bigwig over in Europe, and they have no idea what they're talking about and what my lived experience is? Like, are they able to do that, or what are the long-lasting repercussions of what they've experienced?
Thank you for the wonderful question, Professor. It's online, so I really don't know how to call it. Anyway, the thing was that I alluded to the question of identity of I'm Cisco, and one day you are at Cisco and the other day you find you're out. And the problem with there is a lot of literature on Indian managerial repertoires, and you talk about managing, you're saying yes, the Indian yes, and the Indian yes is nodding your head, which is also saying no. And also neither managing conflict and managing contradiction. So if you talk of context sensitivity, you'd either say, yeah, you are managing conflict and cooperation together in a way. And the problem with the larger way in which the Indian society now is that has invested, at least the people in which these people, a lot of their life is invested beyond their work.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and so if something crashes in the work, it really does. It's more than the loss of the work; it's the loss there, right? So that investment they have actually crushes them. So they are not talking. I did. That's a very valuable point, and I'll really look into that point of overseas team leader. My field work was more direct. That who of your project manager in India. Right. But I get your point, and that many of them tried to rationalize this shame, and many of them actually tried. Some of them tried organic lifestyles. Some of them are going to. Some of them are. This pressure is so much that they go gymming. So a lot of things are there. If you go to the resistance literature in labor process theory, you'll try to see that there are a lot of things that are there of how people try to, divert. Even if I'm here, I'm not here. So they are trying to cope with it, but it really crushes them.
Okay.
It's a great talk. Great talk.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. Interesting question and interesting response. I think it was all very fulfilling and relevant for many of us, even those who are not in the IT industry. Thank you very much, Raman.
Thank you.
Now we can move on to our next presenter. Our next presenter is Sheldon Bromfield from University of Toronto. And his presentation will be performance versus well-being in a fast-paced, deadline-oriented, targets-driven work world. You have about 11 minutes, Sheldon. You can start now. Thank you.
I have a PowerPoint which I'm gonna try and share right now.
Great.
Okay, fine. So I'll just get started in the interest of time. So this is a critical look on performance and well-being versus well-being. And this paper is inspired by my doctoral research, which focuses on government-funded non-profit organizations, specifically in the employment services sector. And prior to COVID, I was in the preliminary stages of my research, and I conducted 12 semi-structured interviews with employment service workers. So the paper is being developed to explore how the logic of performance-driven work largely affects 4 areas. 1, how it transforms the identity of employment services workers, reducing personal agency and encouraging an entrepreneurialist mindset. 2, how it erodes job satisfaction and personal well-being. 3, in specific instances, it can impede professional duty of care. And 4, how it builds existential harm and anxiety. So in my field of study, it's provincially funded nonprofits, specifically those offering Employment Ontario, the Employment Ontario program. Employment Ontario is a government-funded program that involves the coordination of a range of resources, supports, and services to respond to the career and employment needs of individuals and the skilled labor needs of employers. Typically, the program is delivered through the non-profit social service sector. The sector is known for precarious workers and precarious type of work, and the fact that the Toronto labor market is also precarious, you end up with a situation where precarious workers actually serve precarious workers. The non-profit social services sector is highly target-driven, enforced by the funder, and is overall threat of survival if the targets are not met for these non-profit organizations. The obligation to perform to meet targets goes well beyond work itself. There is not only a duty to serve the clients, the people as human beings, but also a duty to provide value for money to the provincial funder. And this duty of care is in contradiction to the kind of fiduciary duty similar to that of a corporation that these non-profits have to the government as a major stakeholder in employment services work within the social services sector. So my analytical framework is mainly three components. Labor process theory. Labor process theory is used to examine the issues surrounding job design and work arrangements, specifically those issues affecting identity and personal well-being. Foucauldian neoliberal governmentality is used to analyze the performance as a form of self-discipline and how workers respond to and co-construct this form of self-discipline. New public management is an outworking of neoliberal governmentality. It's both an ideology and a managerial practice that's incorporated from the private sector based on free market for-profit principles. And new public management reinforces performance as a discipline through a targets-driven work culture and discourse identity. So in terms of the method, so prior to COVID, I've started doing qualitative interviews, and I did some amount of job shadowing and field observations, meeting with some of the supervisors and management within these non-profit organizations, about 10 hours roughly. But COVID had derailed that somewhat, and now I'm working on an online survey, qualitative survey. So the nature of the work environment, based on my preliminary findings, is that there is a continuous threat of retrenchment. There are cutbacks, producing precarity as workers have to continuously justify their existence to maintain funding and keep these non-for-profits open. There's a significant amount of hidden labor, significant amount of time is spent updating a provincial database. There is tons of administrative duties that negate the human aspects of work, including employment counseling and coaching, which is needed to help these workers become employment ready. And the caseloads are heavy. Right? There's a one-size-fits-all philosophy where many of the clients who have complex needs that need to be addressed before they can become employment ready, there's just not enough funding to support these clients. And one of my interviewees said that she has to constantly play the numbers game because work becomes accelerated and intensified during certain times of the year. There are rhythms and cycles throughout the year, especially the end of a fiscal year, as service providers seek to meet their numbers. This is what I would call the tyranny of the fiscal. There's performativity. Stephen Ball defined performativity as a technology, a culture, and a mode of regulation that employs judgments, comparisons, and displays as means of incentive, control, attrition, and change based on rewards and sanctions, both material and symbolic. And anxiety, this word is mentioned in all but one of my interviews so far. And yes, the word is mentioned in terms of part of the complex needs that the clients bring, but I can't help but detect that there's some amount of anxiety that's internalized by these workers as they carry the burdens of the clients and trying to help them to find employment. To continue with themes and patterns found in the preliminary phase of my study, there's supererogatory work, which is based on hyper-exploitation from self and the extra economic pressures to expand numbers regarding service delivery while addressing the complex needs of the service users. Time becomes an enemy. Nicholson's 2019 study of academic librarians analyzed workplace time commitments as a site of power. In this instance, time has become what Foucault would argue as a tool of discipline. As a tool of discipline, time or deadlines lessen the importance of the more meaningful aspects of the job by transforming the human interactions into mechanistic, standardized interactions. And there's this outreach, salesperson, entrepreneurial identity that emerges because these workers talk about hustling to meet targets. One worker, she explained that she's worried about the fact that she's not hustling enough to meet these extraordinary targets that are set out before her. And there's a blurring of work-life balance where work and non-related work activities become seamless because of the high level of psychosocial aspects of this kind of work. As clients are supported outside of work, it's harder to compartmentalize life when your everyday work life involves supporting people who have complex needs. Another one of my interviewees noted that she lives with some scars, and the scars she was talking about are the personal struggles and burdens of the clients that she would bear on a day-to-day basis while trying to help them to become employed. So looking through labor process theory and governmentality, looking through those lenses, I see that there are consistent contradictions that exist. So the human aspects of work are constantly being replaced by standardized aspects of performance. Workers and non-profits struggle to gain control over the labor process, although these non-profits have autonomy to design their programs for training and employment within some specified guidelines from the funder. Elements of the job seemingly reduce agency and independent thinking and induces de-skilling. There are also other factors that stifle training and development for these workers and constrain the measurement of success of these workers and their organizations. Performance for them is measured, one of the main measurements is what they call positive file closures, especially when a client gets a job and they're able to close the file successfully. And that's usually done within 3 months. Well, it's part of the targets. They try to get these people jobs within 3 months, and that's sometimes very difficult. And it comes at the expense sometimes of professional judgment in terms of what's really best in the best interest of the client. Incompatibility in the measurements of success exists because there's this consistent transformation between qualitative work into quantitative outcomes. And identity work and an internalization of managerialism exists as workers are identified as entrepreneurs, as I mentioned earlier. They have to hustle to meet these targets. They play the role as expected by a neoliberal state. And the managerialism reinforces this identity and work culture, often for the survival of their organizations and their livelihoods. So in conclusion, some of these workers definitely they have learned to cope. They have been working in the Employment Ontario program, Employment Services, for over a decade. Employment Ontario started in 2010, and some of them worked in employment services leading up to the Employment Ontario program. They create subversive workarounds. One client said one interviewee said she had to finesse the system to support the clients within the constricted funding requirements of the program. There's exploitation and expropriation. So Marxist researchers would argue that exploitation is found in every job under capitalism. But expropriation becomes apparent when we consider that these workers are performing public sector work, but not treated as public sector workers. There's this constant struggle to not become checked out of the job or burnt out, which is a binary state that these workers constantly fight. And there's compassion fatigue and compassion satisfaction, because these workers, they enjoy the job of helping these clients. They are very empathetic and they have good things to say about all their clients. But on the other end, it takes a lot of care and empathy to carry these clients through to become employment ready. So the carrying the emotional health and dreams affects the well-being of these employment services workers. And employment services workers performance incorporates 3 domains of well-being in learning to cope on the job. One is a stakeholder, and stakeholder includes clients and partners' well-being. 2 is the organizational financial well-being, which includes the staff and the funding of the organization for which they work for, as well as their own individual well-being, which is multidimensional in its own right. And so in a world, I'll just end here, in a world where we are defined by our productivity, it can be difficult to avoid a specific type of dissonance between maintaining a targets-driven identity and personal well-being, specifically amidst the constraints of a fragile economy, as proven by COVID-19. And right there, I'm sure my time is almost up already.
Okay, thank you very much, Sheldon. It's been a while since I have seen a presentation that was deeply rooted in Marxian theory, so that was a very interesting thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So do we have any questions for Sheldon, please? One question. Kira?
Yeah, thanks for your talk. I just wanted to hear a little more. You described burnout as a binary state, and I just kind of wanted to hear a bit more of that, because to me it seems like it could be something on kind of on the spectrum, but if it's like you're either burnt out or you're engaged, or just how you're thinking about that, because I think it's a really interesting thing, and thinking about these kinds of like care and empathetic working that we've seen in like other professions as well.
Right. That's a good question. When I thought about burnout versus being checked out, burnt out takes some amount of time to become burnt out. And being checked out, I just thought about that in terms of being so frustrated with the job that people would just come and just do the job and just try to get it done without being highly engaged in the job. Right. So that's how I was looking at it. And from the interviews, I could sense that was a struggle with these workers. They are very empathetic and they love their clients. They have extremely, it's amazing how well they speak about the clients and how interested they are in serving them. But at one end, you can sense that from their comments that it takes a lot out of them in order to move someone who is very distant from the labor market. But these clients struggle with things like mental health. They're on programs, social assistance programs like Ontario Works and Ontario Disability Support Programs, and some of them are homeless. So they are very, these clients are not the average job seekers. And maybe you and I, for instance, these clients are very distant from the labor market and require a lot of investment, personal investment in time and energy to move them into an employment-ready scenario. And so I just found that it was kind of, yes, I think it could be a spectrum, I agree. But I found that I think they struggle between just being checked out or being burnt out.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. Like I have a colleague who's done some work on burnout and kind of the concept, and part of it is it comes out of nursing and like caring profession. So it's
caring professions, yes, because it is.
Like what you think of as kind of public sector or like civil servant work, where it's kind of not that, whereas this is like, it's you deeply engaged and you do care, but then you hit a point where you can't, it's like too exhausting and you kind of can not care anymore because you're just burnt out. So
exactly, yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we can move to the next presentation now. Our next presentation has two authors, Faizan Imtiaz from Towson University and Insiya Hussain from University of Texas at Austin. And their paper is Exploring the Unique Contributions of Seniors and Millennials Towards Organizational Performance. Faizan, whenever you are ready. You have 11 minutes. Thank you. Faizan, I think you are, let me try to unmute you. Can you speak now?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Sorry,
Thank
I forgot to unmute.
No worries.
Thank you guys for taking the time. Again, I'm going to take you through some work that we did looking at the generational differences in the workplace. And so we're going to go through this a little bit quickly because of the time constraint, but I'll give you a very quick overview of the literature in generational differences in the workplace. I'll go through a couple of experimental studies that we did, and then I'm going to share with you some preliminary findings from some field work, from some applied research that we're doing which is being delayed right now because of the pandemic, but I'll share with you what we have nonetheless. In terms of the literature, in Canada and beyond, the senior population is growing faster than any other demographic group. It's estimated that seniors will comprise 25% of the total Canadian population within the next 20 years. South of the border, it's very, very similar. By the year 2050, the senior population in the US is going to double from 40 million to over 88 million. And in the European Union, it's the same picture. The proportion of individuals aged 80 and older will triple over the next 4 decades. And the pattern is very similar across the vast majority of the world. In China or in Japan, in Italy, a lot of places will increase these drastic shifts. And because of that, naturally, the way we function as societies in terms of our work and our transportation and our layouts will have to be reimagined, certainly. In terms of the impact on work specifically, in 1996 in Canada, 1 in 13 seniors had some form of work, whether full-time or part-time. If we jump ahead to 2015, that number has increased to 1 in 5 seniors. And so not only are seniors increasing in the general population, they're becoming much more prevalent in the workplace. And the issue with this is the workplace hasn't had time to catch up in terms of what do these individuals actually want from their work experiences? How do their desires and motives differ from the traditional workforce, which might have been a lot younger 10 to 15 years ago? And so researchers have argued that organizations that can shift their strategies and recruiting platforms to successfully bring in and retain older workers will definitely experience a competitive advantage. This brings us to the research gap, which is that although seniors are on the rise both in society and in the workplace, their specific needs and motives, especially in applied contexts like organizational behavior, are unknown. And so I'm going to give you a quick overview of the theoretical framework that we're using for these studies. Socioemotional selectivity theory is a very interesting theory which argues that, well, a precursor to the theory is that the human awareness of time, of not only what's going on in my life right now, but also what happened in the past and what may or may not happen in the future, is a distinctly human trait. And this creates an ability for humans to choose what type of goals they're going to pursue in the time to come. And so you can pursue developmental goals, or you can pursue emotional goals. Developmental goals are more catered towards the future. It's doing things that may not be that enjoyable right now, but will likely pay dividends in the future. Emotional goals are, I'm not willing to sacrifice that. I'm going to choose experiences that are better for me right now and that are emotionally rewarding. The main tenet of SST is that in older adults, and as we get older, a sense of time running out, if you will, creates a desire or a shift towards the emotional goals. And so this manifests across several domains like relationships. Seniors are less likely to invest in relationships or people, or to meet people that might pay dividends in the future. They're going to spend their free time with their close relatives and friends now. Emotions, they're less likely to engage with experiences that might lead to negative emotions. And goal orientation, they choose fitness and health goals that are going to pay to reward them in the present. And so if you look across this literature, and it's obviously greater than what I've summarized, but there is kind of a picture that emerges. And that is that older adults may be more focused on the present compared to the past or future, whereas younger adults who tend to be more developmental, they are more willing to sacrifice for future potential, may incline more towards the future. However, today, the direct relationship between aging and temporal focus, which is the idea of how much time do you invest in the past, present, and future, has yet to be empirically tested across younger and older adults. Moreover, the underlying mechanisms, so even if seniors do have this sense of time running out and it makes them more emotionally focused, what causes that? Is it present focus, or is it something else? That remains to be tested. And so we set out to look at the differences between seniors and young adults in temporal focus, and then try to extend that to applied settings like the workplace. Okay, for time. So study one, I'll take you quickly through 2 experimental studies and then share with you our preliminary findings of the fieldwork. First, we wanted to examine how much attention do older and younger adults devote to the past, present, or future, and how these differences are influenced by sense of time remaining in life. Is it true that a sense that time is running out leads to seniors being more focused on the present? And so we hypothesized that, as SST postulates, focus on emotional goals would lead to seniors being more present focused, whereas focus on developmental goals would lead to younger adults being more future focused. We had 353 participants. The younger adults were 25 and under, and the seniors were 65 and older. We had them do a battery of tests, including the temporal focus scale. You can see a couple of the items from each subscale, as well as the sense of time remaining in life measure, which is formally called the future time perspective scale. And so this scale it gauges a person's sense of how many opportunities or how much time they perceive to have remaining in their life. Okay. In terms of temporal focus, we found some clear patterns. So if we look at older adults on the right, they were significantly more focused on the present than the past or the future. Younger adults on the left did show a pattern towards future focus, but it wasn't as strong. So they were more future focused than past or present, but it wasn't as strong as the older adults. When we looked at the mediation, again, looking at, before that, sense of time remaining in life, indeed, seniors in blue had a decreased sense of time remaining in life. So essentially what this means is younger people perceive that they have more time remaining in their lives. This is what we expected as well. What about the mediation? So first we looked at future temporal focus. Younger people were more future oriented, and we found that it was due to sense of time remaining in life. So for older people, because they perceive that they have less time remaining in their lives, that leads to them focusing less on the future. This is what we had hypothesized based on SST. The most interesting finding from the study, though, was the fact that sense of time remaining in life didn't mediate present focus. It actually suppressed the relationship between age and present focus. And what this means is, for older people, having a sense of less time remaining in life actually made them less focused on the present. And when they perceive that I have a significant amount of time remaining in my life, this led to them being focused more on the present, which is the opposite of what SST would predict, because that theory argued that sense of time running out leads to people prioritizing the present. What we find is, no, you actually need to have a belief or a perception that there's something to look forward to, and that makes you more present focused in the here and now. So there's an interesting interaction happening here between the future potential and investment in the present. And so, a couple minutes here. Let me share with you, we wanted to look at, okay, so what are the downstream consequences of these temporal focus? Do they matter in applied settings? And so we created these hypothetical scenarios where we had people envision that they were looking for a job, and they found 2 similar advertisements for jobs. One was focused on the future, and one was focused on the present. And we hypothesized that, building on study 1, older adults would prefer present-focused job opportunities over future-focused ones, whereas younger adults would prefer the opposite pattern. In this study, again, we had 225 individuals. Younger adults, again, were under 25. Older adults were over 65. And this was the scenario that we presented them. The organizations were similar, except we used themes that either focused on the present, such as an established clientele, reputable connections, building on skills and experience, or themes that focused on the future, revolutionizing the job market, creativity, extreme flexibility. And we tested these with a separate sample to make sure that people perceive these scenarios to be either present or future focused as a manipulation check. And what we found is indeed a very significant pattern of, on the left, younger adults they preferred the future focused organization in blue significantly more than the present focused one. And older adults on the right had the opposite pattern. They indeed chose the present focused organization significantly more than the future focused organization. And so not only do these individual age groups invest more in thinking about the past, the present, and the future, but it seems to be impacting their preferences for certain vocational jobs.
Faizan, I'm sorry for interrupting, but you are just over time. Could you just wrap up in 1 minute, please?
Yeah, I'll just wrap up in 1 minute and then we can chat.
Thank you very much.
Any questions? So where we are now is the limitation of those studies is that they were experimental studies. We wanted to go out in the workplace and look at what about actual working adults? And this is what I'll finish with. This is what we have right now. We're still collecting this data, so I don't have any stats, but in people who are full-time working adults, seniors and younger adults, under 25 and over 65, younger workers are more future focused than past or present focused, while older adults are more present focused than past or future focused. So we replicated our experimental findings with working adults essentially here. Older adults also scored significantly higher on job satisfaction, commitment, and engagement compared to younger people. But younger people scored significantly higher on innovative behaviors. And this third finding was mediated by future focus. So for younger adults, their focus on the future actually helps them be more innovative in their current workplaces. And the last thing, which I'll finish with, is the two groups did not differ in work performance, which I think essentially tells me that seniors and young people bring different skill sets and different desires and different motives to the workplace. They bring different levels of satisfaction and innovation and all these factors, but they can both perform equally well. And so they both can contribute uniquely to workplaces. And that's perhaps how workplaces ought to look at different age groups in order to maximize the overall benefit that we can get from all of these different individuals. I'll pause there, and if there's any questions, we can go back or revisit them, but I'll open it up because of time.
Thank you very much, Faizan. I think this study, after you complete it, will have very important implications, especially for generations research. And as you mentioned, our population, both in Canada and globally, is getting older and older. So I think this study will have important ramifications. Do we have any questions? I think Alison has a question. Alison, go ahead, please.
My question is what is the socioeconomic status of the people that you're studying? Because this seems to me to be very much a middle class and upper kind of thing, because you know, it's very easy for your goals and how you focus, whether present or future, if you're not worried about money, right? So I'm just wondering how you're accounting for that in your study. Yeah,
that's an interesting point, and there's two ways I think to address this. The first one is for this research, we did indeed collect data from the experimental studies from seniors who were living independently, which means that they had enough resources as well as you know, cognitive abilities to be able to live on their own and be self-sufficient. And that does indeed maybe make them more middle or upper class. In terms of the working adults, we haven't looked at that yet. So I think it would be more varied. But if they're working full time, the second interesting part to that is one of the things the research is showing is for seniors, many of them are remaining in the workforce, not because they want to, but because they have to out of necessity, because they aren't able to retire at the same age as they did before. And so, and the experiences of working seniors is very different when they're working, when they have to, compared to, well, I just want to stay busy and active.
Mm-hmm.
So this is something that I've actually thought of as we've collected the second round of data, and I think is worth exploring in the future, voluntary versus involuntary work in seniors.
Because like, I mean, also the type of job that voluntary and involuntary, because if you have to work and you're stuck in a precarious job or something that is physically taxing, like where you're on your feet all day or what have you, that's going to impact, you know, people's focus quite a bit. Yeah, very interesting study. Thank you for your talk.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you again. We have about 14 minutes left, so I think it's a good time to move to our last presenter. Last but not the least, we have Kira Lucier. I'm sorry, is it Kira or Kyra? You are mute, so I assume.
It's Kira, yeah.
Kira, okay, perfect. It's Kira Lucier from University of Toronto, and her presentation is Psychologizing Human Resource Management Consulting, Historical Perspectives. Thank you very much, Kira. You can start whenever you are ready.
Great. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much, and thanks for accommodating me in this panel. I realize it makes everything tight for time, so I'll just jump right into it. So I'm a postdoc at Rotman's Institute for the Gender Economy, so I'm researching the relation between kind of gender and work, but I'm trained as a historian, specifically a historian of science, so that'll kind of informs the approach. So I'm taking kind of deviating a bit from the topics of our panel. But basically, this is kind of part of a broader research project on the history of human resource management consulting that looks from about the 1960s to present, largely in the American context, although looking at the kind of also looking at the globalization of these multinational consulting firms. And I'm specifically interested in how the kind of tools, methods, and theories from psychology are used in consulting. So today I'm going to look at one of the biggest consulting firms, which is the Hay Group, which is now Korn Ferry, goes through kind of a series of acquisitions over the course of the past few decades. Hay Group is most well known for the Hay Point system, and I'm going to talk about that today, but it's also broadly important because it's founded some of the earliest hires and important people in the firm are trained as psychologists. So it's a kind of a really key origin, I think, for the psychological approaches to human resource management. And I'm using methods from history. So I'll talk about this a bit at the end, but thinking about what history of science and technology, and specifically concerned with, things about how tools and methods from sciences are applied in other spaces, especially in business and consulting, and thinking about the kind of historical roots of industrial and labor relations. So very kind of broadly, again, very brief overview, but there's a kind of long history of connections, both with industrial psychology as well as personnel management, the kind of what HRM used to be called, date really to the 1920s, and then ramped up in the kind of both after World War I and World War II. And part of this project, thinking both historically and present, is thinking about the way that consultants have served as really important knowledge brokers for companies, importing these tools from psychology. And it's connected as well to some of the work of the kind of history of human relations management, as well as the rise of strategic HRM. Happy to kind of talk about later, probably don't have too much time to get into it. So thinking about how it emphasizes the importance of human capital, and then specifically the psychological dimensions of human capital, so the kind of psychological, social, emotional skills required in workplace and in management. And as I said, it's kind of intervening in broader conversations in ILR about the kind of psychologization of the field, and work of kind of John Budd and Goddard here. And consultants have played a really, I think, an important and understudied role in this process. Again, briefly, I won't go into the nitty gritty, but a kind of overview of the kind of meat of the case study here, which is a history of Hay Group. So I'm pulling on some kind of archival and historical sources here as my data. You can see it's founded in 1943. You can kind of track it over the course. And some of the earliest hires and earliest work, as I mentioned, is in psychology. And then you can see over the course, they kind of expand their operations into different cities, kind of different nations. They expand into different research units, different outplacement services, before being acquired in 1984 and merging with another consulting firm, McBeer & Co., which is another firm I've done a lot of work on, founded by a psychologist. So again, you can see when Korn Ferry acquires it in 2015, you can see it kind of is also acquiring this like kind of decades of work as well as databases of information. So again, briefly, the Hay Group is best known for the Hay point system, but it's actually a earliest home of what's now the Myers-Briggs type indicator. So which is a tool much used by consultants, although much disliked often and criticized by psychologists. But in the 1940s, Isabel Myers, who'd go on to create it, worked for Hay Group and was using Hay Group's kind of existing personnel selection, which is this whole host of personality tests that were used in the 1940s, found they weren't helpful. And so she got a contract with Edward Hay, the founder, to distribute a proto version of the Myers-Briggs. And it would then become widely used. Other company no longer affiliated with the Hay Group, but I think part of the story is thinking of how these kinds of tools got really popular, is looking at the history of these HRM consulting firms. So the Hay point system, which I'll talk about now, was developed by Milton Rock primarily, who had a PhD in psychology and focus on psychometrics. So kind of was really thinking about psychological assessment as well as job evaluation. And his goal was to create a universal measure. So very briefly, it's a numerical system of classifying and evaluating jobs based on the complexity of jobs. And so there's a bunch of different factors that go into it that include psychological elements of kind of know-how and skill, as well as elements about, for example, the number of revenue, number of reporting employees, and then you kind of create each factor and you express a numerical skill that allows you to kind of benchmark salary and compensation structures. And that basic technique is still kind of very commonly used, although part of the issue with it is that the Hay point system was and is a proprietary system. So it kind of issues of how you attempt what is apparently a kind of more objective or quantitative scale versus the realities of jobs being so varied according to companies, and the fact that it's not always can't always access the actual point system that's used to score these jobs. And it's also become a kind of commercial tool for Hay Group. It's how these kind of consulting firms make their money. And again, there's other forms and systems. And so one of the kind of key, as part of my work for Institute for Gender and the Economy at Rutman, I've been thinking a lot about the way and that gender is kind of embedded in how we classify and evaluate kind of work, as well as psychological kind of skills. So between the kind of Hay point system, when it was started, it was in the 1950s, which as you might know, had a kind of even stronger kind of gender division of labor. And I'm particularly talking here about the kind of like a white collar corporation, which is where a lot of the Hay Group points were normed, but it does apply to kind of other positions as well. But these early articles and the early system kind of made clear distinctions between higher and lower level jobs that were also rooted in kind of gender divisions between the kind of executive and secretary, which at the time secretaries were a very feminized position. And so there's a lot of things about the way, so for example, secretaries were classified according to the status of the executive they serve rather than intrinsic features of the job. Again, there's kind of a lot more I could say, but I can talk about this after. And what's interesting is that the kind of gendered construct of the Hay point system did come into attack in the 1970s and 80s by feminist economists as well as activists and practitioners. And they specifically identified the Hay point system for these exact kind of, as an HR practice that assigned less value to work often performed by women. Again, as another example, nurses were scored according to the kind of positions they supervise, because a key part of the Hay point system is the kind of reporting structure, which works fine for certain kinds of jobs, but doesn't always work well for other kinds of jobs. And so there was a series of kind of investigations by the EEOC in the States, although there was also similar kind of movements and pressures in Canada. I know the American context a bit better. And kind of debates over like pay equity, and the specific focus became comparable worth, which it also relied on a kind of quantitative points-based system. And the reason why I kind of keep going over this So this is a quote from a 1981 report about the attempt to use kind of scientific methods to evaluate jobs. And they point out that there's always kind of a reflection of values and how we evaluate different kinds of work. And these values can often reflect things about, say, gender, class, and race, and other kind of hierarchies of power in society. And so broadly, the kind of reason, the insights from history, I think one of the key is that, you know, when Korn Ferry acquired Hay Group, it was a huge deal. And they were gaining access to both the kind of tools they've used, like the Hay point system, but also this database. So they have huge info on, you know, the kind of salary that people make. And they specifically tout the kind of longevity of the Hay point system as a selling feature, saying, oh, it's based in this kind of long historical tradition. Although, as kind of I've pointed out and other scholars, this long tradition actually embeds a lot of kind of problematic issues about the evaluation of worth. And so, as I said, I was trained as a historian of science and technology. And so one of the big kind of insights from that is to kind of unpack what ideas about objectivity and quantification mean. So the fact that the Hay point system is a kind of quantitative point that can map onto pay, which is also obviously a numerical system, is part of a kind of feature that it's a objective system. That means that there aren't kind of values embedded. But of course, I think as both this historical trend point out and the kind of current practices, that it involves these kind of judgments about the relative worth of task skills and people. And so I will end there because I think that's about my time. And thank you so much. And again, thanks for pushing me into this panel.
Thank you so much, Kira. So we still have a few minutes before we wrap up the session. Any questions for Kira's presentation? Then maybe I could just ask a quick question. So, Kira, you mentioned that Myers-Briggs test is not very favored by psychologists today. So what's the current approach of Hay regarding using of that test? Because when I worked or talked with consultants, I understand that they are still heavily using it, even though if it not be scientifically validated, at least as validated as, for example, Big Five personality.
Right. So the consultants definitely still use it, and this is the broader, like what I wrote my dissertation on and what I work on is the history of personality tests. So I've looked a lot at the Myers-Briggs. It is still commonly used by consultants, by a lot of practitioners for sure, and then like leadership development and team building. If you ask most kind of someone in a psychology department, they would probably tell you, no, this is not validated. So I think that's one of the big tensions between the kind of it as a useful tool, because it does kind of, and it's very intuitive and easy to use and easy to explain. And it does actually have a body of literature behind it. Like there's been a lot of research with it that specifically in business and the workplace. But of course, other tests now, like the Big Five, have kind of supplemented it. But broadly, I mean, many personality tests do, even if different ones have different kind of scientific standards, part of it is like thinking about, okay, what are people's different strengths, skills, and how does that affect the way they work together in teams or lead? And so that kind of broad thing, I think, has a long history, despite what the specific tools they actually use are. So, but yeah, I mean, I've also talked to a psychologist who said, yeah, I've been trained to absolutely not believe it, but then he took like a academic leadership program and they used Myers-Briggs, and he said, oh, it was actually really useful. So it's complicated, but
yeah. Well, that's very interesting. Thank you so much, Kira.
Thank you.
So it's I think we are about time. Thank you all who presented today and who joined us. I think it was a great session. I look forward to all studies reading your book chapters or journal articles on these topics. I hope you follow up and basically share your research with the world. It was very enlightening. I learned a lot. I'm sure the audience also learned a lot. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you in other sessions in the conference. Bye for now. Take care.
Bye-bye.